All right, everybody. Hopefully you can see and hear me. I have the chat open, so if I need to turn the sound up or down or anything like that, please let me know and I will do what I can. You can see I'm in a slightly different setting here today. I was running a bit late, so I ended up setting up upstairs here at the church instead of downstairs in the little office I've been using. I will say that it is much easier to deal with the light setup here than it is down there. Anyway, I apologize on Wednesday for canceling Wednesday's episode. I was just in the middle of a couple of other things, and so I apologize. But thank you all for joining me tonight. We will be continuing with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. We're not too far from the end now, just a few more episodes. We are, you'll remember, in the fourth book, because this is divided by books. The overall book is divided into 4 books, and each book into chapters. We are in the fourth book, and we'll be reading 3 chapters of that fourth book today. They're all pretty short chapters, though, so it shouldn't take too long. I'll also say I'm having a little, I don't know whether it's allergy type things or whatever, but a little kind of dry throat stuff today, so you may see me take a drink of water a little bit more often than normal. So just bear with me for that. Before we begin, I'd just like to give you the normal warning that I've been putting on all of these episodes where we've been reading Mere Christianity. And that is that C.S. Lewis, of course, is a very well-known, well-beloved author and kind of amateur theologian, which is what this book fits into. But C.S. Lewis is ultimately a product of his time. And what I mean by that is that he does occasionally express views that we would find at best misguided and at worst downright objectionable today. There are some out there who seem to believe that if someone expresses an objectionable view, that automatically negates all things that they've ever done or said. I do not hold to that view. I think that there is a lot of good that C.S. Lewis does, especially in this book. It gives you a lot of food for thought, whether you're thinking about coming to Christianity or if you're already in Christianity. It helps you think deeper about some of these things. And so I believe we've already gotten past the part in the book where these views, and I'm specifically referring to views on homosexuality and kind of women's place in the world, I believe we've gotten past the point where those views are expressed, but just in case, I still wanted to kind of put this little warning up here. I also don't really believe in glossing over the truth, so if we do come to one of those objectionable passages, I will read it as written, and we will just discuss it a bit when we get to the discussion section. I'd also point out that when we get to that discussion section, I strongly encourage you to type in with your thoughts. Most of the time, unfortunately, a lot of people don't really type in when they or watch these, and so it's often just me kind of expounding on what I think about it. But it would be much more interesting, I'm sure, for all of us if some of you wrote in your thoughts. So please consider that. We'll begin in just a moment. If you remember that I like to start each episode with a poem, and so as we are in the later part of the year, today is Halloween, I've decided to go with a poem called Autumn, which is written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. With what a glory comes and goes the year. The buds of spring, those beautiful harbingers of sunny skies and cloudless times and joy, life's newness and earth's garniture spread out. And when the silver habit of the clouds comes down upon the autumn sun, and with a sober gladness the old year takes up his bright inheritance of golden fruits, a pomp and pageant fill the splendid scene. There is a beautiful spirit breathing now, its mellow richness on the clustered trees, and from a beaker full of richest dyes, pouring new glory on the autumn woods, and dipping in warm light the pillared clouds. Morn on the mountain, like a summer bird, lifts up her purple wing, and in the vales the gentle wind, a sweet and passionate wooer, kisses the blushing leaf and stirs up life within the solemn woods of ash deep crimsoned, and silver beech and maple yellow-leaved, where autumn, like a faint old man, sits down by the wayside aweary. Through the trees the golden robin moves, the purple finch that on wild cherry and red cedar feeds. A winter bird comes with its plaintive whistle and pecks by the witch hazel, whilst aloud from cottage roofs the warbling bluebird sings, and merrily with oft-repeated stroke sounds from the threshing floor the busy flail. Oh, what a glory doth this world put on for him who with a fervent heart goes forth under the bright and glorious sky, and looks on duties well performed and days well spent. For him the wind, aye, and the yellow leaves shall have a voice and give him eloquent teachings. He shall so hear the solemn hymn that death has lifted up for all, that he shall go to his long resting place without a tear. So that was Autumn by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So now let's go ahead and dive right into Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Again, so we are on book 4, and the book is called Beyond Personality, or First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. And today we are reading chapters 3, 4, and 5 of this book. And so the first of those, chapter 3, is called Time and Beyond Time. It is a very silly idea that in reading a book you must never skip. All sensible people skip freely when they come to a chapter which they find is going to be no use to them. In this chapter I'm going to talk about something which may be helpful to some readers, but which may seem to others merely an unnecessary complication. If you are one of the second sort of readers, then I advise you not to bother about this chapter at all, but to turn on to the next. In the last chapter I had to touch on the subject of prayer, and while that is still fresh in your mind and my own, I should like to deal with a difficulty that some people find about the whole idea of prayer. A man put it to me once by saying, "I can believe in God all right, but what I cannot swallow is the idea of him attending to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment." And I've found that quite a lot of people feel this. Now, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, "at the same moment." Most of us can imagine God attending to any number of applicants if only they came one by one and he had an endless time to do it. So what is really at the back of this difficulty is the idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that is, of course, what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there is room for very little in each. That is what time is like. And of course you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series, this arrangement of past, present, and future, is not simply the way life comes to us, but the way all things really exist. We tend to assume that the whole universe and God himself are always moving on from past to future just as we do. But many learned men do not agree with that. It was the theologians who first started the idea that some things are not in time at all. Later the philosophers took it over, and now some of the scientists are doing the same. Almost certainly God is not in time. His life does not consist of moments following one another. If 1 million people are praying to him at 10:30 tonight, he need not listen to them all in that one little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30 and every other moment from the beginning of the world is always the present for him. If you like to put it that way, he has all eternity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes in flames. That is difficult, I know. Let me try to give something not the same, but a bit like it. Suppose I am writing a novel. I write, Mary laid down her work. Next moment came a knock at the door. For Mary, who has to live in the imaginary time of my story, there is no interval between putting down the work and hearing the knock. But I, who am Mary's maker, do not live in that imaginary time at all. Between writing the first half of that sentence and the second, I might sit down for 3 hours and think steadily about Mary. I could think about Mary as if she were the only character in the book, and for as long as I pleased, and the hours I spent in doing so would not appear in Mary's time. In other words, the time inside the story, at all. This is not a perfect illustration, of course, but it may give just a glimpse of what I believe to be the truth. God is not hurried along in the time stream of this universe any more than an author is hurried along in the imaginary time of his own novel. He has infinite attention to spare for each one of us. He does not have to deal with us in the mass. You are as much alone with him as if you were the only being he had ever created. When Christ died, he died for you individually just as much as if you had been the only man in the world. The way in which my illustration breaks down is this. In it, the author gets out of one time series, that of the novel, only by going into another time series, i.e., the real one. But God, I believe, does not live in a time series at all. His life is not dribbled out moment by moment like ours. With him it is, so to speak, still 1920 and already 1960. For his life is himself. If you picture time as a straight line along which we have to travel, then you must picture God as the whole page on which that line is drawn. We come to the parts of the line one by one. We have to leave A behind before we can get to B, and cannot reach C until we leave B behind. God from above or outside or all around contains the whole line and sees it all. The idea is worth trying to grasp because it removes some apparent difficulties in Christianity. Before I became a Christian, one of my objections was as follows. The Christians said that the eternal God who is everywhere and keeps the whole universe going once became a human being. Well then, said I, how did the whole universe keep going while he was a baby or while he was asleep? How could he at the same time be God who knows everything and also a man asking his disciples, who touched me? You will notice that the sting lay in the time words. While he was a baby. How could he at the same time? In other words, I was assuming that Christ's life as God was in time, and that his life as the man Jesus in Palestine was a shorter period taken out of that time. Just as my service in the army was a shorter period taken out of my total life. And that is how most of us perhaps tend to think about it. We picture God living through a period when his human life was still in the future, then coming to a period when it was present, then going on to a period when he could look back on it as something in the past. But probably these ideas correspond to nothing in the actual facts. You cannot fit Christ's earthly life in Palestine into any time relations with his life as God beyond all space and time. It is really, I suggest, a timeless truth about God that human nature and the human experience of weakness and sleep and ignorance are somehow included in his whole divine life. This human life in God is, from our point of view, a particular period in the history of our world, from the year A.D. 1 till the crucifixion. We therefore imagine it is also a period in the history of God's own existence. But God has no history. He is too completely and utterly real to have one, for of course to have a history means losing part of your reality, because it has already slipped away into the past, and not yet having another part because it is still in the future. in fact having nothing but the tiny little present which has gone before you can speak about it. God forbid we should think God was like that. Even we may hope not to be always rationed in that way. Another difficulty we get if we believe God to be in time is this. Everyone who believes in God at all believes that he knows what you and I are going to do tomorrow. But if he knows I am going to do so and so, how can I be free to do otherwise? Well, here once again the difficulty comes from thinking that God is progressing along the timeline like us, the only difference being that he can see ahead and we cannot. Well, if that were true, if God foresaw our acts, it would be very hard to understand how we could be free not to do them. But suppose God is outside and above the timeline. In that case, what we call tomorrow is visible to him in just the same way as what we call today. All the days are now for him. He does not remember you doing things yesterday. He simply sees you doing them, because though you have lost yesterday, he has not. He does not foresee you doing things tomorrow. He simply sees you doing them, because though tomorrow is not yet there for you, it is for him. You never supposed that your actions at this moment were any less free because God knows what you are doing. Well, he knows your tomorrow's actions in just the same way, because he is already in tomorrow and can simply watch you. In a sense, he does not know your action till you have done it, but then the moment at which you have done it is already now for him. This idea has helped me a good deal. If it does not help you, leave it alone. It is a Christian idea in the sense that great and wise Christians have held it, and there is nothing in it that is contrary to Christianity. But it is not in the Bible or any of the creeds. You can be a perfectly good Christian without accepting it, or indeed without thinking of the matter at all. Chapter 4, Good Infection. I begin this chapter by asking you to get a certain picture clear in your minds. Imagine two books lying on a table, one on top of the other. Obviously, the bottom book is keeping the other one up, supporting it. It is because of the underneath book that the top one is resting, say 2 inches from the surface of the table instead of touching the table. Let us call the underneath book A and the top one B. The position of A is causing the position of B. Is that clear? Now let us imagine, it could not really happen, of course, but it will do for an illustration. Let us imagine that both books have been in that position forever and ever. In that case, B's position would always have been resulting from A's position, but all the same, A's position would not have existed before B's position. In other words, the result does not come after the cause. Of course, results usually do. You eat the cucumber first and have the indigestion afterwards, but it is not so with all causes and results. You will see in a moment why I think this important. I said a few pages back that God is a being which contains 3 persons while remaining one being, just as a cube contains 6 squares while remaining one body. But as soon as I begin trying to explain how these persons are connected, I have to use words which make it sound as if one of them was there before the others. The first person is called the Father, and the second the Son. We say that the first begets or produces the second. We call it begetting, not making, because what he produces is of the same kind as himself. In that way, the word Father is the only word to use. But unfortunately, it suggests that he is there first, just as a human father exists before his son. But that is not so. There is no before and after about it, and that is why I think it is important to make clear how one thing can be the source or cause or origin of another without being there before it. The Son exists because the Father exists, but there never was a time before the Father produced the Son. Perhaps the best way to think of it is this. I asked you just now to imagine those two books, and probably most of you did. That is, you made an act of imagination, and as a result you had a mental picture. Quite obviously, your act of imagining was the cause and the mental picture the result, but that does not mean that you first did the imagining and then got the picture. The moment you did it, the picture was there. Your will was keeping the picture before you all the time, yet that act of will and the picture began at exactly the same moment and ended at the same moment. If there were a being who had always existed and had always been imagining one thing, his act would always have been producing a mental picture, but the picture would be just as eternal as the act. In the same way, we must think of the Son always, so to speak, streaming forth from the Father, like light from a lamp, or heat from a fire, or thoughts from a mind. He is the self-expression of the Father, what the Father has to say. And there never was a time when he was not saying it. But have you noticed what is happening? All these pictures of light or heat are making it sound as if the Father and Son were two things instead of two persons. So that after all, the New Testament picture of a Father and Son turns out to be much more accurate than anything we try to substitute for it. That is what always happens when you go away from the words of the Bible. It is quite right to go away from them for a moment in order to make some special point clear. But you must always go back. Naturally, God knows how to describe himself much better than we know how to describe him. He knows that the Father and the Son is more like the relation between the first and second persons than anything else we can think of. Much the most important thing to know is that it is a relation of love. The Father delights in his Son. The Son looks up to his Father. Before going on, notice the practical importance of this. All sorts of people are fond of repeating the Christian statement that God is love. But they seem not to notice that the words God is love have no real meaning unless God contains at least two persons. Love is something that one person has for another person. If God was a single person, then before the world was made, he was not love. Of course, what these people mean when they say that God is love is often something quite different. They really mean love is God. They really mean that our feelings of love, however and wherever they arise and whatever results they produce, are to be treated with great respect. Perhaps they are, but that is something quite different from what Christians mean by the statement, God is love. They believe that the living, dynamic activity of love has been going on in God forever and has created everything else. And that, by the way, is perhaps the most important difference between Christianity and all other religions. That in Christianity, God is not a static thing, not even a person, but a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life almost, a kind of drama, almost, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. The union between the Father and the Son is such a live, concrete thing that this union itself is also a person. I know that this is almost inconceivable, but look at it thus. You know that among human beings, when they get together in a family or a club or a trade union, people talk about the spirit of that family or club or trade union. They talk about its spirit because the individual members, when they are together, do really develop particular ways of talking and behaving which they would not have if they were apart. It is as if a sort of communal personality came into existence. Of course, it is not a real person, it is only rather like a person, but that is just one of the differences between God and us. What grows out of the joint life of the Father and the Son is a real person, is in fact the third of the three persons who are called God. The third person is called, in technical language, the Holy Ghost, or the Spirit of God. Do not be worried or surprised if you find it or him rather vaguer or more shadowy in your mind than the other two. I think there's a reason why that must be so. In the Christian life, you are not usually looking at him. He is always acting through you. If you think of the Father as something out there in front of you, and of the Son as someone standing right here by your side, helping you to pray, trying to turn you into another son, then you have to think of the third person as something that is inside of you or behind you. Perhaps some people might find it easier to begin with the third person and work backwards. God is love, and that love works through men, especially through the whole community of Christians. But this spirit of love is, from all eternity, a love going on between the Father and the Son. And now, what does it all matter? It matters more than anything else in the world. The whole dance or drama or pattern of this three-personal life is to be played out in each one of us. Or putting it the other way around, each one of us has got to enter that pattern, take his place in that dance. There is no other way to the happiness for which we were made. Good things as well as bad, are caught by a kind of infection. If you want to get warm, you must stand near the fire. If you want to be wet, you must get into the water. If you want joy, power, peace, eternal life, you must get close to or even into the thing that has them. They're not a sort of prize which God could, if he chose, just hand out to anyone. They are a great fountain of energy and beauty spurting up at the very center of reality. If you are close to it, the spray will wet you. If you are not, you will remain dry. Once a man is united to God, how could he not live forever? Once a man is separated from God, what can he do but wither and die? But how is he to be united to God? How is it possible for us to be taken into the three-personal life? You remember what I said in chapter 1 about begetting and making. We are not begotten by God, we are only made by him. In our natural state, we are not sons of God only, so to speak, statues. We have not got Zoe or spiritual life, only bios or biological life, which is presently going to run down and die. Now the whole offer which Christianity makes is this, that we can, if we let God have his way, come to share in the life of Christ. If we do, we shall then be sharing a life which was begotten, not made, which always has existed and always will exist. Christ is the Son of God. If we share in this kind of life, we also shall be sons of God. We shall love the Father as he does, and the Holy Ghost will arise in us. He came to this world and became a man in order to spread to other men the kind of life he has, but what I call good infection. Every Christian is to become a little Christ. The whole purpose of becoming a Christian is simply nothing else. And our last chapter this evening, chapter 5, the obstinate toy soldiers. The Son of God became a man to enable men to become sons of God. We do not know, anyway I do not know, how things would have worked if the human race had never rebelled against God and joined the enemy. Perhaps every man would have been in Christ, would have shared the life of the Son of God from the moment he was born. Perhaps the bios or natural life would have been drawn up into the Zoe, the uncreated life, at once and as a matter of course, but that is guesswork. You and I are concerned with the way things work now. And the present state of things is this. The two kinds of life are now not only different, they would always have been that, but actually opposed. The natural life in each of us is something self-centered, something that wants to be petted and admired, to take advantage of other lives, to exploit the whole universe. And especially it wants to be left to itself, to keep well away from anything better or stronger or higher than it, anything that might make it feel small. It is afraid of the light and air of the spiritual world, just as people who have been brought up to be dirty are afraid of a bath. And in a sense, it is quite right. It knows that if the spiritual life gets hold of it, all its self-centeredness and self-will are going to be killed, and it is ready to fight tooth and nail to avoid that. Did you ever think, when you were a child, what fun it would be if your toys could come to life? Well, suppose you could really have brought them to life. Imagine turning a tin soldier into a real little man. It would involve turning the tin into flesh, and suppose the tin soldier did not like it. He's not interested in flesh. All he sees is that the tin is being spoiled. He thinks you're killing him. He'll do everything he can to prevent you. He will not be made into a man if he can help it. What you would have done about that tin soldier, I do not know. But what God did about us was this. The second person in God, the Son, became human himself, was born into the world as an actual man, a real man of a particular height, with hair of a particular color, speaking a particular language, weighing so many stone, the eternal being who knows everything and who created the whole universe, became not only a man, but before that a baby, and before that a fetus inside a woman's body. If you want to get the hang of it, think how you would like to become a slug or a crab. The result of this was that you now had one man who really was what all men were intended to be, one man in whom the created life derived from his mother allowed itself to be completely and perfectly turned into the begotten life. The natural human creature in him was taken up fully into the divine Son. Thus, in one instance, humanity had, so to speak, arrived, had passed into the life of Christ. And because the whole difficulty for us is that the natural life has to be, in a sense, killed, he chose an earthly career which involved the killing of his human desires at every turn. Poverty, misunderstanding from his own family, betrayal by one of his intimate friends, being jeered at and manhandled by the police, and execution by torture, and then, after being thus killed every day in a sense, the human creature in him, because it was united to the divine Son, came to life again. The man in Christ rose again, not only the God. That is the whole point. For the first time we saw a real man, one tin soldier, real tin, just like the rest, had come fully and splendidly alive. And here, of course, we come to the point where my illustration about the tin soldier breaks down. In the case of real toy soldiers or statues, if one came to life, it would obviously make no difference to the rest. They are all separate, but human beings are not. They look separate because you see them walking about separately, but then we are so made that we can see only the present moment. If we could see the past, then of course it would look different, for there was a time when every man was part of his mother, and earlier still part of his father as well, and when they were part of his grandparents. If you could see humanity spread out in time as God sees it, it would not look like a lot of separate things dotted about. It would look like one single growing thing, rather like a very complicated tree. Every individual would appear connected with every other, and not only that, individuals are not really separate from God any more than from one another. Every man, woman, and child all over the world is feeling and breathing at this moment only because God, so to speak, is keeping him going. Consequently, when Christ becomes man, it is not really as if you could become one particular tin soldier. It is as if something which is always affecting the whole human mass begins at one point to affect the whole human mass in a new way. From that point, the effect spreads through all mankind. It makes a difference to people who lived before Christ as well as to people who lived after him. It makes a difference to people who have never heard of him. It is like dropping into a glass of water one drop of something which gives a new taste or a new color to the whole lot. But of course, none of these illustrations really works perfectly. In the long run, God is no one but himself, and what he does is like nothing else. You could hardly expect it to be otherwise. What then is the difference which he has made to the whole human mass? It is just this, that the business of becoming a son of God, of being turned from a created thing into a begotten thing, of passing over from temporary biological life into timeless spiritual life, has been done for us. Humanity is already saved in principle. We individuals have to appropriate that salvation. But the really tough work, the bit that we could not do for ourselves, has been done for us. We have not got to try to climb up into spiritual life by our own efforts. It has already come down into the human race. If we will only lay ourselves open to the one man in whom it was fully present, and who, in spite of being God, is also a real man, he will do it in us and for us. Remember what I said about good infection. One of our own race has this new life. If we get close to him, we shall catch it from him. Of course, you can express this in all sorts of different ways. You can say that Christ died for our sins. You may say that the Father has forgiven us because Christ has done for us what we ought to have done. You may say that we are washed in the blood of the Lamb. You may say that the Christ has defeated death. They are all true. If any of them do not appeal to you, leave it alone and get on with the formula that does. And whatever you do, do not start quarreling with other people because they use a different formula from yours. Okay, so that is the end of what we're reading this evening. So we come now to the discussion. I've got several thoughts about all three chapters. Some of them are quite new thoughts, very interesting, but I would love to hear if any of you have any thoughts out there. I'm going to start, I think, with the bit about time. It is very... he kind of digs into some pretty difficult concepts. And part of the reason that the concept is in and of itself difficult is because it's difficult to truly understand anything that you have not experienced. A man can sympathize with a woman who has experienced sexism, but if he himself, not being a woman, will not have experienced it, and he can't truly grasp or understand it. In a similar way, we can't really grasp or understand a truly eternal being that always was and always will be. My argument in the past is that this is perhaps part of the reason why you get something similar to the creation story in Genesis, with the 7 days and so forth. And, we've had a lot of argument about whether it was created that way or whether there was evolution or stuff like that. My personal opinion is I do not see the two things as being contradictory. My opinion is that, the very important part of that story is the very first line. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the important bit. The rest of it, the exact method that he used to create the universe, is not really that important, in my opinion. But I'd like you to go with me just so we can kind of understand what C.S. Lewis is talking about here with the time thing, is just go with me on a little thought experiment here about why I think it's the creation story as written in Genesis is not necessarily that important to worry about. So imagine for a moment, and again, because we are individuals locked in time, it is difficult for us to imagine this. But imagine for a moment that you are a being like God. You have always existed. You will always exist. Honestly, for a person or a being, whatever you want to call it, in that situation, there is absolutely no difference between 1 second and 1 billion years. And, we say that the Bible was inspired, not written by God. So it's not like we don't generally consider that God was like a CEO dictating the books of the Bible to those who wrote them down. We say that he inspired them. So you as God, an eternal being, are trying to get across to a being whose life is finite. Being, if you take the traditional authorship of the Bible, Moses is who we're talking about, who supposedly wrote the first 4 or 5 books there. And you're trying to get across to Moses, whose life is a finite thing, the fact that, you slowly created the universe over 13 billion years, ultimately resulting in mankind and so forth. I mean, among other, glories of creation. It's a virtually impossible concept to grasp. Because even the numbers are too vast for a person to grasp. It is too great of a number for any of us to truly understand. Even if we can write it down on paper, we can't understand it. I think one of the best ways to look at it is, I don't know if any of you ever seen the show The Cosmos. With, there was an old one with Carl Sagan, and there was a newer version with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about, kind of the history of the universe. And the point is that you're talking about a number that is so vast, so great, that if all of time was a calendar from from 12 a.m. January 1st to 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, that the whole of human history, not even just recorded history, but going back into like Neanderthals and stuff like that, so the whole of human history, which is somewhere in the region of 20 to 50,000 years, depending on how you do it, is basically roughly the last 30 seconds of that year. And so a being who has existed before even that vast length of time of the calendar is trying to get across to a being whose life is less than a second in that calendar, that he created the universe slowly over billions of years. And it seems to me that if you think about it like that, you are likely to end up with a story like that in Genesis. That he said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Not that he slowly gathered the, atoms of various gases and stuff into such massive, objects that they, cause a nuclear fission and reaction and fusion constantly going on and create stars and suns and so forth. That's just the way I think of it. So that's just kind of the way I want to talk about the time one. I want to talk briefly about the middle chapter where he talked about the good infection and about Christ always being there from the beginning. This is a very brief comment. I just point out that this is actually quite similar to the way it is in the Gospel of John. So he talks about this in slightly more complicated terms, but I almost, what was seemed interesting to me is that as he spoke of the Father and the Son there in that chapter, about how they always had existed together, neither without the other, it very much reminded me of the beginning of the chapter of the Gospel of John. I'll read it for you for a moment. It says, and this is King James Version, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And the Word in this situation, at least as has been interpreted by 20 centuries of theologians, the Word is the Son, or Christ. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There you go. it's just like he says, it's that they exist. Yes, the Son exists because of the Father, but there was never a time before the Father produced the Son. He puts it in a more complicated way in the book. And I just thought it was interesting because to me it really sounded like he was making a very complicated version of that sentence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So that is something, just my brief thought there. Second, so the last thing I'd like to discuss right now is in the last chapter. I thought it was very interesting the way he talked about humanity as being one thing. And I found this to be very, very interesting. And because for a couple of reasons. One, and I'm not saying that this is the correct interpretation of Christianity or anything, but it makes me think of the idea of universal salvation, that if he is, saving the whole mass is one thing, then that you have the that all would be saved at once by Christ becoming part of it. Now, I'm not saying that that's what the proper interpretation of Christianity is. I'm just saying that would kind of arise from the suggestions he's made here. But what I thought was interesting is that what came to my head when he talked about, how do you put it here? They're all separate, but human beings are not. They look separate because you see them walking about separately. And then he talks about how if you could see humanity spread out in time, a lot of separate things dotted about, but it wouldn't look like one single growing thing, rather like a very complicated tree. That's the way he put it. I don't know if this is what he had in mind, but I kind of wonder, there was a type of tree, and I'm trying to remember exactly. Let me see if I can find it real quick. A type of tree, I want to say it's a type of aspen. Yes, I believe so. So the largest, some of the largest organisms that we are aware of, as a single entity, are actually a single thing. So one of them, I don't know if you ever heard of something called the quaking aspen or the trembling aspen. It's a type of tree. But what's interesting is that you see a forest of trees when you look at it. You see a whole group of trees, and yet those trees are in fact one plant. They're basically individual roots of a single plant. One example here is, there's one, I believe in Utah, which is 108 acres of land, all covered by basically a single plant, a single quaking aspen. Now, what you see if you're there is basically a wood, a forest of aspen trees. But the truth is that it is one thing, and the way he wrote about humanity as one thing really kind of struck me with that image of the aspen trees. I believe there's also some fungus or something that's supposed to be like insanely huge. Like here we go. There's a fungus, a sort of mushroom type thing in Oregon somewhere that's supposed to be roughly 9 kilometers square. It's underground or whatever, but it's all one organism. And though you may see little, shoots of it here and there coming out, through the thing, that it is, in fact, a single organism, 3.5 square miles in size, 2,240 acres, if you want to think of it that way. If you were to dig it up and weigh it, it would perhaps be as much as 35,000 tons. So with this fungus, I believe it's called a honey fungus, and with the trembling aspen, you get this very interesting ideas of kind of what C.S. Lewis is talking about here with humanity. He's suggesting that we are all connected. We are all one mass. So that is quite interesting, some quite interesting imagery from C.S. Lewis there. That is where we are going to wrap up this evening. Since I don't see anyone making any comments, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So our next episode will be on Wednesday, the 4th of November. I will remind all of you, in case you've got things to do tomorrow, like come to church if you're someone from St. Andrews, that there is a time change tonight. So there will be 2 1 a.m.s, essentially at, it'll go 1 a.m., and then an hour later it'll be 1 a.m. again, because we are falling back. I would also remind you, if you are watching from inside the United States and you are a U.S. citizen and have not yet voted, I will remind you that there is an election on Tuesday. So consider voting. If you are someone from who is an attendant here at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, where I'm broadcasting from, in San Antonio, Texas, I would point out that we will actually be having a special, we do evening prayer services online 5 days a week right now, but our evening prayer service on Tuesday, while it'll still be online and you'll still be able to see it, will also be a special in-person service. I do know it's election day, so I know some people would rather stay at home and, obsess over the election returns, and that is perfectly fine if that's what you want to do. But I thought that some people might prefer to kind of get their mind off it for a while and help reorient themselves to the fact that whoever wins the election, whatever the outcome, ultimately the thing that is important is our faith in Christ. So if you would like to, you can certainly join us in person here at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in San Antonio, Texas at 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time for evening prayer. You could also, again, catch it online at any of St. Andrew's normal media outlets. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining me. I will see you again on Wednesday, and have a great evening.